sections, we created a series of models and set up relationships between them in the database. In this video, we will attempt to query that database using Entity Framework Core. A quick breakdown of what's going to happen in this section. We will begin by reading rows from the database using EF Core alone or paired with link. We will then move on to other types of queries like update or delete, and make a clear distinction of the different ways in which you can load data from tables with relationships. That way you will learn to efficiently work with explicit loading, eager loading, and lazy loading. Towards the end of this section, we will dissect the n+1 problem and the query object pattern. We'll kick this section off with an introduction to reading operations. In this video, we will read multiple values from the database and return them as a list. We will then attempt to load a single row based on some criteria and return null if that row can't be found or if it doesn't exist. We will also talk about the change tracker and how to increase performance by disabling tracking when we don't need it. As to better query the database, I have actually set up the authors table and the books table. I've added some dummy values in them, so I'm gonna show you right here. If I right click on the table and go on view data, we can check both the authors and the books. You can see the authors have added a few of them and a few books with dummy titles and dummy creation dates. Now we can go to the books controller and specifically in the index action. In case you don't know, controller methods that are accessed by routing are called actions on MVC frameworks. And what we want to do is we want to call the toListAsync method of the books property. The books property of the context object is something that we used to access the books entity and essentially the books table in a previous video of the previous section, but we didn't get into depth of why we do that. Entity Framework Core provides this property so that we can treat the whole table, the whole books table, as a single collection. So when we write the code, it's like we are interfering with a collection that is stored in memory, like a list or a queue or a stack, in that kind of way. And this helps a lot. In this case, we need to Entity Framework Core to fetch asynchronously for us a list of all the books stored in the database, and of course don't forget to use the await keyword and also add the async keyword on the method declaration. After we've fetched the books, we are ready to pass them down to the view. This is ASP.NET Core MVC. This is assumed knowledge, so I'm not going to describe why we do that. Now let me throw a not implemented exception on the details method, which is the method that we're going to study next. And I'm doing that so that we can successfully build a project, run the solution, and see for ourselves if we visit the route, the /books route, if we are able to see the mock books I have inserted in the database by hand. So now that we run the project, if we go to the books route, we expect to see a table of books. And indeed we do. We have book 1, book 2, book 3, along with a few links and the ISBN. Ignore the empty author field for now, we will come back to that in later videos. In the previous action, we used Entity Framework Core to fetch a list of all books stored in the table. In the details method, we're gonna want to fetch a specific book based on its ID. Remember, the ID field is the primary key. Let's see how we can do that. First, notice that we use a nullable integer representing the book's ID. You can tell that it's nullable by the question mark following the type declaration. When using nullables, it's always a best practice to perform some checks first. So, if the field is null, we're going to call the notFound method, which essentially results in a 404 page being presented to the end user. If the ID field is not null, then we want to cast it to a nullable integer. And then we want to call the SingleOrDefaultAsync method. Now that's a weird name for a method. I will explain in a moment what that means. Inside the method, we can use an expression to match the book with the desired ID. Now the SingleOrDefaultAsync method returns a single book that matches the expression and not a list of books. If no book matches the expression, then it will return the default value for the book class, which is of course null. That is why we need to perform one last check and return not found if the book was null. Otherwise, we can pass the book down to the view and display it to the end user. Now let's quickly run the application. And then we can use the same route as we did before. We can visit the books page, where we will be presented with a table or a list, call it what you like, of all the books in the database. And if we click on the details button, we can see a few of the details about the book. Again, ignore the empty author field for now. Now let's talk a little bit about the change tracker. The change tracker is a centralized place where Entity Framework keeps all changes that have taken place on certain entities. Every time you extract one or more entities from the database, those entities are tracked by default. That way, if you make a change on those entities, that change will be persisted, but not when you make it. Rather, it will be persisted on the database when you call save changes or save changes async. Those two are methods provided by EF-core, and you call them on the database context object. The thing is though that tracking is expensive, and sometimes, if not most of the time, when you extract a row from the database, you do not want to alter it in any way. You may want to use it for a computation or simply display it on the screen. We can increase our app's performance by disabling tracking when we do not need it. Remember that tracking is enabled by default. The good news is that disabling tracking is extremely easy. You just call the asNoTracking method on the books property in this case. We're gonna do that both on the index method and the details method.